Okay, so for this demonstration, you should have already secured the edges of your paper down with some masking tape. The reason that we do this is it stops the paper from warping when it's wet, and you need to make sure that you use watercolour paper. If you use normal paper, the paper is too absorbent, it's not thick enough, and it's going to rip. You will also need a cup of water and a paintbrush. I've gone for this size paintbrush. And then you will need watercolours. And then I just use a really old rag, but you will use napkins or tissues if you're in school. So this is what you should all have. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through 6 different watercolour techniques that are the basics really that you need to understand before we go ahead and start applying this to any of our work in class, okay? So the first technique that I'm going to talk you through is the wet on dry technique. So if you think about what that might mean, it's basically going to be wet paint onto dry paper. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to put that there actually so that you can see what I'm doing a bit better. Hang on. That's no better. Okay, so this is my paint cup. Excuse the state of it. Okay, so you're going to get a wet brush. And you're going to go ahead. Now, with the watercolours, you need to remember that these are currently dry. So if I touch that, I'm not going to get paint on my hands because the paints are dry in the palette. So to activate the paint, you need to wet the paint. So I'm just going to wet my brush and I'm going to go in with a blue. You can choose any colour that you like. Oh, that was a horrible sound. Sorry, everyone. Okay, so now I've got my paint on my brush and my paper is dry. So I'm going to start applying the paint to the surface of the paper. Now, what's going to happen, if you can imagine, this paper is dry, obviously, and this paint is wet. So what's going to happen is the paper is going to start absorbing the paint quite quickly. And watercolour dries very fast as well. That can be a good thing, but it can be a bad thing at times, because if I just left that now and popped to the toilet and came back, I'd have a line all the way across here. So now I'm going to wet my brush so that my brush is clean. I need to get into the habit of that. Clean brush. So this is just water now, and I'm going to start just bringing this paint down with nothing but water. So if we were using coloured pencils to make the paint, to make pencils lighter, we might use white coloured pencil. If you were using acrylic paint to do what we're doing here, again, you might use white acrylic paint. But with watercolour, it's often the case that to get a gradient like this, you will just use water to do it. Okay, so that's your first one. That is just a wet on dry. Next, we're going to use the most common technique and the most sort of often used technique, which is called wet on wet. So if you think about what we just did with wet on dry, that's basically the application of wet paint onto dry paper. We're now going to apply wet paint onto wet paper, and this is really good for blending. So what I want you to do, obviously make sure that that brush is clean and you've not got any of your remaining paint on it. And then you're going to go in, you're going to wet your paintbrush with a generous amount, and you are going to wet the whole area, not outside of it, just the area that you want the paint to go. Don't overdo it either. Okay, it sort of acts like a barrier actually, and have you got a steady hand, then it won't go outside of that. Okay, now what I'm going to do, again quite quickly, is I'm going to go in and I'm going to choose I'm going to choose a purple this time. So remember, that circle there is wet, and I'm going to go in with my paint, obviously wet paint. Now, what you'll tend to see with this, the difference is that you don't need to work as much. The paint will naturally move a lot quite fluidly through the water, hence it being watercolour. So it's just learning how to manipulate that, really. If this was an angle, it would all drip down and it would stop. And I'm going to go right around this actually and do the full circle. So it moves a lot better when it's wet and wet, as you can see here. I'm just going to wet my brush off. I'm going to clean it, wet it again. I just want this to just lighten up in the centre. There we go. So that's your wet on wet method. Now, I'm going to dry this off. Oops, I keep knocking this. Let me bring this down a bit now. Okay, so dry off your brush. Next, what I'm going to teach you how to do is just a quick gradient, and it's from bottom to top, so down to up. So again, for this, you just want to wet. Oh, I've still got a bit of purple on there, but that's okay. Okay, so you want to wet the whole circle, or the whole area that you're working with. You guys should be doing it on circles as well. And then you're going to go in with quite a bit of paint. I'm going to go for a green this time. Fun fact, green is Mrs. Woodward's favourite colour. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start at the bottom. Can you see the paint just already starting to spread upwards? Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm not going to wet my brush, I'm not going to dry my brush, but as I'm going up, it will start to dilute naturally because the space is already wet. So it should get lighter as it gets to the top. Obviously you can do this the other way around. You can go top to bottom if you like, you can go left to right, but just to show you quickly, I'm going to go bottom to top. Now, I'll give you another trick. If you think, oh, well, that was a bit of an anticlimax and I really wanted that top to be a lot lighter, what you can do is you can treat your paintbrush like a sponge. So you really want to wet that brush and get all of the paint off so it's nice and clean, sorry. And then if you go back over it, you'll start to see, let me just dry that off, that it soaks it up. Dry it off in between. Let me bring this over here to show you what I'm doing. Dry my brush off. I'm just gonna go over it. So this is where you just take the paint out, really, if you wanted it to be lighter at the top. And then you can just obviously go back in with your brush and push this up. I'm gonna wet that off again. I just want to blend this bit out a bit more. There we go. Okay, I'm happy with that. Okay, and then next I'm going to show you how to blend two colours. So I'm wetting my brush, I'm drying my brush so it's clean, and then I'm going to wet my brush again, and I'm going to wet the entire, oops, I've just gone out of my shape there slightly, which that's okay. Okay, so that's wet. Now, what I'm going to do, it's important when we do it with wet on wet because then it blends a lot easier. So I'm going to choose two colours that go well together. So let's go with an orange on the left. Oh, that was so satisfying, and then I went out of line. Oh well. Okay, so I'm going to go orange on the left, and then on the right, I've wet my brush off. Don't just put it straight back into your paint. I'm going to go yellow. If you blend in two colours like this, you don't necessarily need to wash your brush off in between because we want that nice. I'm wetting my brush now, but I want it to blend with each other. So I'm just going to tidy this up a bit up here. And there you go. So that was wet on wet to blend. Okay, some do's and don'ts. So, what can I show you? Okay, so just a tip. Now this is dry. So let's say that I was trying to paint detail of an eye. That would be perfect because that's dry now. And if you go in with wet paint or with dry paint, that's going to be fine. If I then tried to, I'll show you on this one. So let's say I'm doing an eye, okay? I know eyes aren't this colour, but let's just go in with a wet sphere. Okay, there's my sphere. And I want you to imagine that this is just a normal eye colour. So I'm going to go in with yellow. Okay, so if you're trying to do fine detail, think about what's about to happen. So I'm gonna wash my brush. This is still wet. I'm gonna wash my brush and I'm gonna choose black for my pupil. What do you think is going to happen the second that I touch that black paint onto this wet yellow? Oops, might be helpful if you could see. Okay, so I'm about to do some detail on this wet circle. Ready? So it all just bleeds out. Now if you wanted to do, say, an outline, it just wouldn't work very well. I mean, don't get me wrong, it looks really cool, but if you're trying to do really fine details, you really need to wait until it's dry. Like with this one up here. If this is dry and I now want to go in and just do a little bit of an outline on it, say like this, then that's going to be fine because it's dry and it's not going to bleed. Okay. And I guess the last tip would be wet on wet, and if you were doing skin tones. So there's my wet sphere, and let me just mix up a quick skin tone. Okay. Right, so I'm going this skin tone here. This is just a watered down ochre colour. Okay, so I'm going for my lightest colour. And if I wanted to add some type of blush to it, maybe it's a bit of rose to the cheek, which would be a brighter colour, that's going to blend quite nicely in with this. But I wouldn't start out with my darker colour. I would always start out with my lighter colour. And blend those just like that. There we go. Lovely. So there you have it. Some handy watercolour tips from me.